Welcome to First a Follower podcast, presented by Youth for Christ USA. First a Follower aims to address the unique challenges and opportunities youth ministry leaders face today. Through engaging discussions and expert insights, we aim to provide practical guidance, relevant resources, and support for the spiritual formation of youth leaders as they navigate the complexities of reaching and discipling the next generation. I'm your host, Cory Huffman, and I work on the Youth for Christ USA Leader Formation team. On this episode, I welcome on YFC Director of Leader Formation and my boss, Dr. Jessi Sigander, and Senior Director of Content and Research for Fuller Youth Institute, Brad Griffin. Dr. Jessi Sigander is an educator, leadership developer, and lifelong learner. With over 20 years of experience in education, training, and supporting neurodivergent learners, she is passionate about helping people grow into who they are called to be. Brad Griffin develops research-based resources for youth ministry leaders and families through his work with Fuller Youth Institute. He is also a volunteer pastor, a speaker, and a writer, having co-authored over 15 books. On this episode, we're discussing new data and research put out by Brad and his team at the Fuller Youth Institute. All right, Brad Griffin, Jessi Sigander, how are you guys doing today?
Good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for being on. We are excited to jump in as well. I think we got to have you, Brad, at our National Leadership Conference back at the end of January, and I think you guys had just kind of finished your FYI report on Gen Alpha and faith at that point, right? Was it released at that point?
It was just before we released it publicly. Yep.
Okay.
You guys were some of the first to really hear us try it out with with youth workers. So
got to test it on us a little bit, but
yeah, it was really fun.
It was good, and people really enjoyed getting to sit in that. Jessi, I think you got to listen to some of that, right?
I've had a chance to go through it, and it has been super interesting to read, and also I think just affirming of the narrative and what we see is happening in kids in our world today. So it's so great to have research like this available.
Yeah, and we've had a lot, obviously, in the last several years. There's been a lot of research, a lot of conversations around Gen Z, but this is kind of the first thing we're seeing that's a lot more geared toward Gen Alpha. I feel like we've been hearing people talk about Gen Alpha and kind of give out some thoughts and ideas, but this is kind of some nice concrete research. So maybe as we jump in, Brad, can you just define Gen Alpha for our listeners? Who is Gen Alpha, and maybe what are even some of the high level characteristics of this generation?
Yeah, I would love to. And, I appreciate what you said about, we've been hearing so much about Gen Z. We're still hearing about Gen Z. And quite honestly, some of the youth ministry content and research that we still quote goes way back. I still hear people quoting all the time findings from the National Study of Youth and Religion, which was, millennials. We were doing some of our original Sticky Faith research around that same time, and it was 20 years ago. Yeah. So a lot has changed. A lot of change has changed with young people. Yeah. And we really felt like it was time, and we felt really convicted about listening to young people talk about their experiences in their own words to try to get a sense for this generation. And when we're talking about this generation, generational theory is a little bit messy. Not everybody agrees, but we chose the 2010 date as sort of the start. So roughly those born 2010 through 2024 or 2025. So, they're already folks are already talking about, there's sort of a new generation now, perhaps being born. But all these kids who are around now, they are aging up. They're aging up into the middle school and high school years. They're aging up into our ministries. The oldest among them are turning 16 right now. So trying to sort of understand, all right, what looks the same? What's different? How can we really understand? And so we try to dig into research, what little research there is that has been looking at, these young people in this cohort, and then also wanting to hear from them directly. So we started out with a couple of waves of a survey, ended up surveying nearly 3,000 teenagers, 13 to 17. So we got them kind of on that upper edge of the generational bubble. I have a 17-year-old in my house, and, so he's technically Gen Z, but exhibits some of these characteristics, has been a fun dialogue partner as well. And at the same time, I serve with middle schoolers at my church pretty regularly. So I get to see some of these distinctives. I also am married to an 8th grade math teacher, so we have fun conversations about some of this as well. One other sort of distinctive I'll note before we move on is you can kind of think about Gen Alpha teens as the first generation to come of age post-pandemic. So, when the pandemic really hit and kind of in the thick of those complicated, years, Gen Z were mostly already teenagers. They were already in middle and high school. But for Gen Alpha, they were kids. And so, they are really the first generation to become teenagers post-pandemic, and in the world that we have now, which has just been shaped by a number of different forces, that really accelerated during that time. So that's kind of one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is Gen Z have learned a lot about AI. They're digital natives who had to learn about AI, whereas Gen Alpha are really AI natives. And that is a very different environment. And they're, again, coming of age as all of that technology is accelerating way beyond what we can comprehend. And they're just trying to grow up in the midst of it. So they've got some unique sort of things happening.
That's really good. Yeah. As I think about my kids, I've got a 12-year-old who's obviously square in the middle of Gen Alpha, or right in there anyways. And then my daughter is 16 and going to be 17. So she's kind of in the, the Gen Z end of Gen Z. But as I was reading through the report, I'm like, she definitely exhibits a lot of Gen Alpha things that I'm reading in this. Maybe you could talk for just a minute, Brad, of what went into some of this research. So you mentioned like 3,000 students, can you talk a little bit about like how you gathered some of it, what that looked like? As your team kind of went through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we worked hard on shaping some interview questions first survey questions. We're actually doing interviews right now. So I was just yesterday on a couple of interviews with some teenagers from around the country. It's so super interesting. Some of that will probably come back in a little bit later. But our survey we developed looking at some of our own instruments in the past, others who've looked at young people. We worked with Future of Faith, a sociology group who does a lot of multidisciplinary research to kind of help us think through some different domains. We've done a lot of work in the past at FYI on identity, belonging, and purpose, and really understanding those as the 3 big questions of adolescence. And one of the things we wanted to dig into more is, okay, what are some of those differences? How is this generation going about both asking and answering those questions? And then not only that, but also the where. Where are they finding this sense of who they are and where they belong and what they can do, which, as we'll get to, that was one of the more kind of surprising pieces of this initial round. You asked about collecting data, and that's been super interesting because we initially went through some of our own networks and, youth ministry leaders, pastors, all kinds of folks who maybe subscribe to our email or follow us on social media or in some of our networks, including Youth for Christ. And one of the things that has happened over the past year, I mentioned AI, AI survey taking bots, that sort of technology has developed so rapidly that it's now really easy to write out a really detailed prompt to have a bot take a survey as a 14-year-old boy from Indiana, and, to tell it to do certain things and not do certain things. And anyway, we realized we put in a lot of different checks and safeguards, and ultimately realized that we could not be certain at the end of the day because of how sophisticated that these technologies have become and how sophisticated some of the things they're getting around. all that to say, we dumped a bunch of data and we ended up actually going with a survey recruitment provider that does sort of triple checking the humanity and validity of their participants way more than we could do. And that's how we ended up with our main survey sample that we kept. So that group was about 54% Christian. We asked about religion in different ways. About 25% fell into what we call the nones category. So they answered no on that question about identifying with a faith or religion, but in a couple different ways. About 13% said they were not sure or still figuring it out. And the rest were affiliated with some other faith tradition. So we were excited about that spread because in particular, we felt really compelled that it was important to listen to non-religious young people and not just those affiliated with some sort of, ministry or church. So that part has been pretty exciting for us.
I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting that we live in a day and age that we have to think about AI bots when giving surveys to even know what clean data is, because AI has so rapidly changed the world we live in. I think it's such an interesting thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's remarkable, right? It raises, in some ways, it's kind of emblematic of what this generation is growing up in, because they've got to figure out what's real, what's true, what is human. If we are having a hard time knowing that for sure, even in research, then of course, this is hard for kids who are just trying to grow up.
Yeah. Yeah. How much more for them who are asking some of those questions, now with a whole new layer of technology added on.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting
and
thing.
increasingly going to that technology to find the answers. I mean, I think one of the things about this generation, there's a lot of curiosity, and there's a lot available to them. And there is this sense they've grown up in a world in which you really can get an answer to any question immediately. And that is even accelerated now because, I did this just myself yesterday. I could search in Google for the answer to this question and know that I will have to sort through a bunch of results, or, I could have Gemini or chat do a much more, I could do a lot of work for me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there are things where that's really handy. And also sometimes you really don't know where that's coming from. And it's already hard to find truth on the internet anyway, but this sense of these sort of voices that are becoming more and more authoritative. And so what does it mean to try to answer your biggest questions in a world where, chat is an authoritative voice?
Yeah.
That's a whole different thing.
I think about that even with my own kiddos and having conversations with them of, oh yeah, I just listened to this podcast, or I just, watched this thing on Instagram, or I just, what I mean? That is really they're taking it in and they're sitting in their rooms and they're thinking about it and they're ruminating on it. And I'm not even aware of the things that they're listening to or the conversations that they're having inside of their head, and just the power of what that does and the questions that it brings up. And some of those being really fantastic spaces to have conversations. And also some of them going, I didn't know we were in that space right now, or, thinking through those things. So I thought that was one of the most interesting pieces of this research, was just the amount of kids who look to online spaces to answer their questions about spirituality.
Yeah, absolutely. In our study, 1 in 4 said they were changed by something that they, heard or came across or read online. And 1 in 3 said that they learned more about faith or spiritual things online than in person. Those were big, those are big proportions. And some of that's TikTok theology, some of that is, it's all kinds of things, right? And of course, some of those influences have been around a long time. So it's not that that's totally new. It's, I think, the sheer volume and then the sort of authoritative power or question of that. Now, I think, and I talk to a whole lot of young people who say, they don't really trust what they hear in those spaces. So we can get to trust in a little bit, but that all those influences that are coming at them, they're trying to figure out how to filter that. Yeah. I think my big question is for those who are younger and, again, sort of they're going to be coming into these adolescent years, will they have those same filters and that same level of suspicion? Developmental psychologists talk about, Lisa D'Amour talks about this. She writes a lot about adolescence, about how skepticism doesn't really kick in until about age 14. That's part of why she thinks that's a pretty good age to actually give a kid a smartphone or social media, not necessarily all at the same time, but that you need some skepticism when you get into this realm where everything is coming at you all the time and you're trying to figure out how to filter. It's a lot to ask of a 12, 13-year-old to have wisdom and discernment. That's just not really how their brains work yet.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, it's a lot to ask of a 16-year-old, but at least some of that's starting to kick in a little bit more.
Well, I have a like I said, I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, and my 12-year-old, he just wants the content. Like so you're right. He's not,
and it's YouTube all day for a lot of those kids. Yeah.
He'll take it, we limit it, but he'll take whatever he can get. Whereas my daughter's like, that's AI. That's anything that comes up. She's like, being a little more skeptical. Well, we can linger in this piece about, them being in these digital spaces, because to me, it raises a lot of questions. I mean, obviously there's more to understand about why and what that looks like, and why they're learning more on the digital spaces than in person. But it makes me just wonder a little bit about what that means for youth leaders, who are, whether they're in a church ministry or like YFC, they're reaching kids on campuses and connecting with them in these, after school programs and different things. Should they be considering how to connect with kids more online, or does it mean, like, do they need to push back so they can get kids in person, like, or something in between?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And of course, we've been wrestling with this in ministry for a while, so this isn't, of course, new. I do think that while some of the terms have changed, certainly as some of the platforms have changed. And I think part of it too, of course, in, 2020, 2021, we were saying, thank goodness we have all these digital platforms where we can connect when we can't be in person, or when, maybe students aren't comfortable being in person, or whatever the situation is. So now that question is, okay, not just what can we do, but what should we do?
Mm-hmm.
What is healthy? What is human? What leads to flourishing? What can we do that we can only do in person? What are we offering that's of value? I think for most youth workers, we can set aside I have to become a digital creator and like create content and try to get that out there. That's not, most of us really shouldn't be doing that, because we're not that good at it.
Thank goodness. Thank you for saying that.
I'm not that good at it. And I think that temptation, I think we can kind of set that aside as, you don't need to feel pressure to do that. I think we absolutely need to stay out of some spaces. There are some spaces that are they're unwise for us to be in. I mean, Snapchat, for example, I think that's an unwise space for a youth leader to be, frankly, because the whole premise is, these things go away. There's zero accountability. Any sort of anonymous platform where you're unknown, that should be totally off limits. But I also think when we're in these digital spaces, we need to be really careful and think about group encounters as opposed to, one-on-one, like limiting that direct one-on-one as much, again, for our safety as well as young people's, and our longevity in ministry and our integrity. But there are times and places where, Discord, for example, I know youth leaders who use Discord because their students are there and they like to get together and connect there. And it can be a place where there's more than one adult and where there's more than one student, and there's some interaction in times and places when they're not together. I was just talking to a 15-year-old yesterday in an interview I was doing for this project, and he was talking about how he had a group of friends. One of the places that he has felt the most belonging was in a Discord group chat, and that those people, most of them, they were also friends in person, but that it was through the group chat and the conversations they had there that he used the term, that group really became like family to me. Mm-hmm. And for us to respect that that's some of how young people are engaging, and it's where maybe they might feel more comfortable asking a hard question there or something like that. At the same time, leaning into what we can really only do in person. And I would say too, like developmentally and age-wise, I do think this probably looks different with middle school and with high school. With middle school, I think our best bet is to do things in person, to be together, to give them experiences where they can move their bodies, where they can be with other bodies, where they can have fun, where they can engage. All those, like, middle schoolers need that so much. I think with high schoolers, maybe that blurs a little bit differently. The other thing about middle schoolers is that it helps us respect where families are and the differences there. There are middle schoolers who are all in on all kinds of tech all the time, and middle schoolers whose families are really limiting and are, making big, sometimes, socially unpopular decisions about technology access and platform access. And so the worst thing we can do is make some teenagers in our group feel alienated because we're spending so much time and energy connecting with other teenagers in those digital spaces. By high school, more of that levels out. So it's a little bit less. Of course, there are still limits and should still be limits on what families are doing there. But I just think in the middle school space, we need to be really discerning.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good thought between what can be done online and what needs to be done in person. And I think so much of that is like the embodiment of Christ takes place in person so often, of the integration and of people knowing the Holy Spirit through us. And that a lot of that happens in person, just in those conversations and that side-by-side time. And as much as so many kids feel safer online in some ways, I think they're still craving that in-person connection, whether they have words for that or not. And I was so interested in your report around the importance of a trustworthy or a non-judgmental adult and what that looks like in our world today and why that's important to kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things we know from others' research is that there is a significant trust gap. And this is across the board. So Americans generally trust each other less than we used to. So this is about adults. This is about society. There's this growing gap. It's connected with more isolation and loneliness. We know those rates are through the roof with adults. Okay. And of course, all of that is the environment that kids are growing up in. So the other thing we know is that successively, generation to generation, there is a trust gap between young people and adults, and young people in institutions in particular. And so if you represent Jesus, like it or not, you represent an institution. And I don't like that I represent an institution because I want to just represent Jesus. But the reality is you're associated with, right? You're associated with Christianity, the church, all of that. And so we know that our kind of baseline then is a lower level of trust than it used to be. So we wanted to ask teenagers, tell us about what makes a trustworthy adult to you. When you think about an adult you trust, what are those qualities? And we learned that the number one quality across the board, across all different kinds of demographics, that makes an adult trustworthy to a teenager is they listen to me without judgment. So there's listening, but it's not just listening, it's listening without judgment. I was just talking to a leader the other day who said, I think most of us in youth ministry think we're really good at listening without judgment, and we're probably actually not. And even I think the key distinction here is actually the perception of judgment. Yeah. We may really be trying to withhold judgment. We may really be, generous in our listening, but the only thing that matters is if that kid perceives that they're being judged. And so I think our assumed baseline needs to be a baseline of distrust and a baseline of we have to prove that we're actually willing to listen to and see them and not judge them. Now, we're trying to dig in more to understand what that judgment is about, to try to understand in our interviews, what does it feel like, when an adult or adults like judge you? What does it feel like to feel respected by adults? Sort of the opposite of that. The number one characteristic that makes an adult trustworthy is listening without judging. The next one is respecting my views, even if they disagree. And so those really kind of go together, that teenagers want to be heard. They really want to be heard for understanding. And they want to be heard even if that adult might disagree with them, that they still are respected for, for their views.
Isn't that such a reflection of the world we live in? Couldn't we say that of all of us in the world today, right? I mean, I think about adults. How many of us just want to be listened to? And how many of us want to be able to disagree with one another and still love and respect one another? I think about the listening piece. I mean, we're not good listeners. And when I think about what it takes to listen well, it is listening fully intent, not listening and thinking, how am I going to respond? How can I tell you how this relates to me? What is the next question I'm going to ask you? Like, I think sometimes when we think about, what makes somebody non-judgmental, it's sometimes the posture even that we take in listening. I know so well when I sit across from the table from a person, if they're listening to me or if they're listening because they need to get to the next thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. And I just think it's such a different, it's this different posture shift in that space, and so important for our world today, but especially for kids.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I remember hearing a while back somebody define listening as going into an encounter with open to the possibility of being changed because of what you hear. And I think about that sometimes because I think we're in such an era when that is not how we approach listening, right? Yeah.
We have the gospel, right? The gospel that we want to share. Sometimes we come into listening with an agenda of, how I want to change you in this process versus I want to hold space for your story. We talk about that all the time with Three Story, my story, God's story, and your story. And sometimes we're so quick to want to speak so quickly of all the things that we're not truly listening in that space. We have an agenda. And I do think, Gen Alpha knows when we have an agenda, and that is not an authentic feeling for them. If they think that they are an end to a mean to an end, then it's not, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that whole agenda piece is so important, especially for leaders who are in, an evangelistic organization, right? And this is, but I get asked this question sometimes, what's the role of speaking truth to a young person? What if we do have a judgment? Like, what if we do need to say, hey, something, we actually have there's a gospel, there's a biblical, principle here, or there's something that, and I think what I want to say is, we really need to consider our timing. And that's always true, but I think maybe even more true now, that we first need to establish trust. This is listening to establish trust by withholding judgment, by respecting who they are and their views, by showing up consistently. These are some of the other things that make an adult trustworthy, right? That you follow through, you show integrity, you show up when you say you're going to show up, you actually want to get to know me well. These are all important to building trust. I think we need to see it as a core evangelism and discipleship task for us to do that work first. And that then when we have established a sense of being a trustworthy adult, that then we have opportunity to speak truth. Now, we can be speaking truth and modeling truth all the way along, but those harder truth or a word of correction, that we can offer hey, I have a different perspective. Do you want to hear it? And that they actually will be ready to hear it because they know that you care about them and that you've cared enough to hear their perspective first. So I think it's about timing more than it is about, we can't say anything that might upset a young person. It's not that at all. It's just that, do you want to be heard? Like, do you actually want that word to be received? And, when it comes to the gospel, I also think it's important for us to think about how, it may not be this sort of, this might be an unpopular thing to say. It may not be conviction of sin that draws somebody to Jesus. It might be actually being compelled by the love of God, by being known and seen by God. It might be compelled by stories where, I'm preparing to preach this Sunday, so I'm going to preach a little bit right now on this story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. We know this story well, but I just am struck again at how Jesus really sees her, and he does speak a truth about her life, but he does not moralize. He does not condemn. He does not shame. And she feels seen, and she jumps right into theology. And they go there. Jesus is so willing to go there with her that he sees something that's true about her life, for whatever reason that is. And, for whatever, happened to her, that he sees her and she feels known and loved. And in that encounter, they talk about really deep things. He reveals to the first person in John's gospel, at least, that he's the Messiah. This is one of the longest dialogues that's recorded in the New Testament. Clearly, this is an important encounter with an important person. Sorry, I'm like going down a rabbit hole now, but there's so much there. And I wonder about how young people will be more receptive to the truth about the God who wants to set them free and bring them living water if they're seen and known first. And we see that all the way back in Scripture. This is not just a Gen Alpha thing.
It's so good. It's such a good tie to the 3-story language we use in Youth for Christ. I've been in conversations with a few different people lately of this question. Is the gospel the right news or is it good news? And it's both, right? It is the right news, but man, is it good news in my life? And am I living it through my life? And are kids experiencing the authentic gospel in me as I share the good news and the right news? And I do think something about Gen Alpha goes, I want the information, but I want to experience Christ in you as well. Like that is the thing that compels me towards the Father.
Well, and I think too, that back to that question of what can we do in person that we can't do online. Online, you're going on TikTok, you're just hearing information, you're getting talked at. When you go into a youth group or in that space or meeting with a youth leader, you get listened to, or you can get listened to. And that can be, maybe that's the thing that's different about being in person is you're heard and listened to and have that space. So I think that's a great call out there.
Yeah. And experiencing some friction. This is kind of interesting too, but this sense of, young people are going out less to meet with friends in person or to do things outside of the home. And I think some of that is about relational friction that we might experience and some caution there. And one of the things we can provide in these group spaces is actual relational friction. They might disagree with somebody. They might have to be with somebody that they don't like being with all the time. They get to discover a little bit about themselves and themselves in relationship with other people. That is all part of growing up. It's all really healthy. It's also part of our discipleship. Part of our discipleship is coming up against people and ideas and experiences that make us a little uncomfortable, that stretch us a little bit, and that challenge sometimes our own sense, as opposed to, interacting with an AI companion, for example, where everything is affirmation. Everything is just reflecting back and mirroring and affirming and building up. And there's no friction there. There's no truth telling there. There's no encountering a true other. And that's a huge miss if that's missing from teenagers' lives.
Yeah. That's good. Well, even as leaders, I mean, obviously digging into the listening piece, kids want leaders who will listen and not be judgmental, but that doesn't mean they don't want to hear truth or don't want to hear some response once you've built up some of that trust, right? And obviously there's ways you can do that are loving, and through listening to understand and be able to provide some of that even in those spaces too. Mm-hmm. Another thing that jumped out to me, a couple of things that jumped out to me, and these are, I think, is in a couple different spaces, are the importance of family, and how much kids, this group Gen Alpha listens to their parents in terms of finding faith. That's like the most influential person in terms of faith is their parents, mm-hmm. and youth leaders are like, like third or fourth on the list, right?
Pretty far down.
A little ways down. So that struck me a lot as, and then the other piece that struck me as well as that is the just amount of time they are at home, and seeing their home as like the safe space and where they want to be. So it makes sense that those two things are in conjunction. But as a youth leader, someone who, go and we work with teams that are going and doing evangelistic work, meeting kids on campus, invite them, but also I serve in a church and work with high schoolers and have kids that are coming, thinking about how do we get kids out of their house, get them away, get them out the door to come and have these experiences. And so that piece of it. And then also how do I be someone that kids will listen to? And maybe it's that trusting piece, but also I know you have some stuff in there about some suggestions about maybe working with parents, working with families, and doing some holistic stuff there too. So maybe you could talk about that or unpack that just a little bit too.
Yeah. We've known for a while from research that the family, the home, whatever that family looks like, that is still, for like statistically speaking, for the majority of young people, that's still the primary environment where they're formed. It is still, for better or worse, the greatest influence on their faith and their faith even into adulthood. And so that's just the real thing that we've been working with for a long time. The difference that we see now is I've never heard teenagers report this much importance on their parents, their family, mm-hmm. That, their family is the place they feel safest or who they trust more across domains of identity, belonging, purpose, and faith. And, friends are up there, but family edges above every time. And so that is, and when it comes to faith influence, actually, family is way above. And that's true for kids across the religious spectrum. It is even more true for kids who do identify as Christian. I will say for, nuns, that friend influence is up there, but even, in all cases, family is so important. And so I think it's time for us to take that way more seriously in ministry and even in, parachurch ministry outside of the church, that sometimes parents are kind of an extra or an afterthought, or I don't even know how we would get to them, but to realize that the home is so important. And for a lot of young people, so not universally. And of course you've got, leaders working in contexts with incarcerated youth or with youth who do not live at home. I mean, there's so many circumstances, but that sort of in general, this theme we hear that young people, both that the voice of family is so important, which I do think is part of an after-on effect of their childhood being impacted by pandemic, being impacted by polarization, being impacted by all these other factors. Adults in their lives are less connected to not just church, but any sort of civic or social organization or, anything outside the home. Again, that's not true for every kid, of course, but that's sort of the trend. What's happening at home is a whole mix of things. We're trying to dig into this more to understand how much is their preference for home a home alone by myself, like in my bedroom with the door closed, just scrolling or gaming, how much is that home factor actually relationally being with, my family? How much is it a both and, right? When I'm out, I got all this stuff coming at me and I need my decompression time. How much is it my family just gives me that safe place to be who I really am? And I think, and as we're listening to teenagers actually talk about this, it is a mix of that, right? It is a mix of that. But by and large, we're hearing a lot of stories about kids who think really highly of their parents and who feel like their parents really listen to them. And I think there's something about like shifts in parenting styles and parenting wisdom, that has contributed to that as well. There's a lot of high attachment parenting, a lot of like emotional regulation kind of language and feelings wheels sort of, and I think that has all contributed to teenagers feeling like, oh yeah, I've got adults in my life who are trying hard to understand and to make room for me, to feel what I'm feeling and go through what I'm going through. I think for youth workers, then the unique challenge is also, okay, but how do we get them out of the house? How do we also help them see the importance of these environments where teenagers need to be with other teenagers? And they really need significant research shows they need adults in their life who are not parents. And that developmentally is something that, only we have something so unique to offer in our youth ministries, where we've got these non-parental adults who can be trusted figures and mentors. And then we've got other peers, and it's not school. It's not, you may have clubs that meet in a school environment, but it's not the classroom. It's a different sort of social contract than what's happening with teachers. And that sort of third space, I think, is more critical than ever. And we might really need to work on making it worth getting out of the house for. And I think that's worth really thinking about. What is it that actually is worth getting out of the house for?
When you think about the past few generations, what would you say are some changes in what they value, or what makes it worth, getting out of the house now versus 20 years ago?
Yeah. I think about these narratives. This is so interesting. I do think the teenage rebellion narrative has really, faded. Certainly there are teenagers who are pushing against their parents, and that's developmentally normal. You can talk to plenty of parents who say, my kids prefer me. That's not what it feels like, right? But other parents, I was talking to another parent this week about this research, and she was like, yeah, my kid likes to stay home and play board games with us on the weekend. And I love it. And it also kind of worries me, right? And so there's this,
so true.
I don't know, should I be worried or should I not be worried? What do we do with that? I think that's really complex. I do think that's a generational shift. Think back to all the John Hughes movies of the 80s, where, you like Breakfast Club. I watched it again, maybe 6 months ago. And I thought, wow, we are not in the Breakfast Club era anymore.
Yeah.
Be that good or bad.
Be that good or bad. Good and bad. The adults in all those movies were either villains, they were absent, right? Parents were clueless. There were very few positive messages. And, now we see much more, even in media, in movies and in shows, much more of a positive parent presence, much less animosity, much more of a sense of parents could actually be the good guys, or at least, benign as opposed to negative. There's so much of a shift there. So I do think there is an overall shift of you can be a teenager and not hate your parents, and that's okay. I think it's always been true. It just wasn't always cool. Now it's totally fine to think your parents are cool. And that is a shift. That's really different. I think that plays into, all these other things and trust, right? And this sense, again, of getting out of the house. I think some other shifts there around comfort. We really are in a societal moment where we prioritize comfort and self-care and do what feels good to me, and I can have a me day and, treat myself. And this kind of language is out there, and there's good in it, especially for those of us who have been in burnout culture and churn culture.
Yeah.
But kids use that language, right? Like, I'm grinding and then I just need some me time. And that often, more often, looks like just chilling out in my bedroom. It looks like zoning out. For some, it's not scrolling. It's actually literally just laying in their bed with their eyes closed and listening to music. Or, some of these are like classic teen things that still happens. For others, it is going out and being active, going on a walk, going on a run. It's doing things with friends. I want to be clear, teenagers still hang out with friends. And there are some who, I think there's a broad continuum here. And I think where the concern probably should be is with those who, the 1 in 5 who say they almost never hang out with friends in person for fun. Like, that should be concerning to us. But, beyond that, there can be a really healthy, it can be really healthy for a teenager to even say for themselves, all these friends are going out and doing this thing. I don't really feel like doing that tonight, or today. As long as that's not their response 100% of the time. So learning boundaries is a good thing, but I think the culture we're in, and I do think that's a generational shift, Yeah.
It doesn't seem like they have FOMO like the older generation, like my generation. That was like, if people were out doing stuff, I got to go. I'm going, and and it seemed like everybody wanted to be where the action was. And, like my kids are like, I don't care. Like, I'll stay home.
And that social media has shifted in that way too, where we were talking about FOMO with teenagers a lot, a handful or, the past decade or so, where social media made it so obvious because you're constantly posting the things you're doing and then other people are missing out. That's not so much how kids are using social media now. They're curating more than they're creating. So many of them their feeds are just, it's entertainment, it's news, it's much less, what are my friends doing right now? There's still some of that in some platforms, but social media is not used in the same way that it was for Gen Z. And I think there's some good and bad there, right? There's less pressure to put a perfect image of myself out there, on Instagram. That pressure is still there. It's just less of everybody has to do it all the time. It's more of I'm kind of curating the things that come into my life and into my feed, and kind of feeding the algorithm is actually what kids spend more time doing, whether that's, on YouTube or TikTok or, wherever they are. That's a pretty different sort of media. It's media consumption, more than creation, other than the kids who you feel like you have to be really good to be a content creator now.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know.
Some of it's good.
Well, as we move maybe toward wrapping up a little bit, I think a question for both of you guys, as you've Brad, as you've lived in this, Jessi, as you've kind of read through this research, what is something what maybe surprised you most in this research and jumped out at you? It's just like, wow, that is surprising. And maybe what's been most concerning in this data as well?
Yeah. I'd be interested in hearing Jessi's responses first, actually, if we're both answering those questions.
Yeah. I think that we talked about a lot of them. I think the importance of family, as we have that conversation, I'm like, yes, I can see even my own kids, but generationally, I would never have said that about my teenage years. So I think that's it's just an interesting thing to think through, even as we consider ministry and how we connect with kids and how much we communicate with parents. And are we communicating to parents that the safe space, the places we're, curating for their kids are safe places that their parents would even want their kids to go? And what part do they have in, pushing them out the door? So I think that's such an interesting thing. And then I think, you've somewhere in there, you say, I'm just going to read it because it just blew my mind. AI is not just for homework. Increasingly, teens spending time at home are also using AI for conversation and companionship. A recent Common Sense Media Study found that 72% of teens have used AI as a companion, and 52% do so regularly. So I literally read that. And then I said to my 16-year-old son, I'm like, are you serious? Is this actually happening? And he was like, yeah. He's like, Mom, if a group of kids sits down at a table and we don't know each other, it's way easier to pull out my phone and talk to an AI bot than to have to like put myself out there to have a conversation with somebody across the table. And he's like, it just takes one person to do it. But if everybody's staring at the phones, we're never going to have a conversation. And so, you know, I'm aware of AI, but I think that how commonly it's used was something that was shocking to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Same. Same.
What about you, Brad? What's sticks out as being most surprising?
Yeah. A couple things that were surprising to me. One was for sure, the centrality of home as a trusted space and as a space where teenagers feel not only identity and belonging, that makes a lot of sense, but also purpose. Purpose, that there's so much purpose in home, and I'm so curious about what all that's about, you know, and how because I would have. I would have put home way lower on the list just because, you know, you got to get out and do things and try things. And yet there's something purposeful about their interactions at home. And I wonder what that is. And I want to explore that more. The other one that is surprising and was exciting to me is among non-religious teens that close to 60% said that they essentially didn't say that they're not open to faith, meaning they might be open to faith. So they may not be actively looking, they may not be actively curious, but they're not totally uninterested. And I thought that was just really hopeful. You know, the sense that we've got a generation, when we asked open-ended questions around why you don't practice a faith while you're not part of a faith, this idea of like having a bad experience, you know, with a church or having religious trauma or anything like that, that was really, really low, like 2% of the responses. You know, the vast majority of responses were like, I don't know, I just haven't had a lot of experience with faith, you know, or I don't know yet. And I think that's so hopeful for those of us who really care about those teenagers who are not following Jesus right now.
That's good. That's good.
I did have a question for you, Brad. Mm-hmm. Like when we think about kids specifically who have no religious backgrounds, besides that piece right there about their openness to spirituality, was there anything else that stood out to you in that group of kids?
Yeah. And this would be the concerning part. We did find, and we wrestled with this a little bit on how to report it. We did find some concerning patterns around just in general, they seem to report less social support. So a little less connection to their families, less connection with adults overall. They were more likely to say they have no one to turn to on some of these different key issues. And outside of faith, it makes sense that they might not have anybody to talk to about faith, but even about, you know, identity and belonging and purpose and some of these other things. And we wrestled a little bit with this. We actually talked to some other researchers and looked at other studies. And this is a pattern that, I mean, and I'm making a huge generalization here, but that while we don't want to say, oh, non-religious kids are doing really badly, that's not true of all kids who are non-religious. At the same time, there is sort of this pattern of they just tend to have less support around them. You know, they tend to not be part of other supportive communities either. It's not just not being part of a church or whatever, a religious group. And so I do think that's I don't know, just something to flag and just to keep in mind, you know, that there's more vulnerability with a young person who's not connected with faith. Being part of a faith community is such a resilience building kind of thing in their lives. And for us to be just aware of and sensitive to that. Again, not judgmental about it and not making all kinds of assumptions, but also just aware, that there may be less social support. There may be a little less stability in a young person's life who isn't actively involved in some way in some sort of faith community. And not to shame them for that at all, right? But just to know that support, that is something that we have to offer too, is belonging and support and just more of a social support system.
That's good. Well, and I would ask, but I think I've got the answer here, as youth leaders are thinking about where to start in understanding this generation. It feels like this report is a great place to start. So if people want to find, and it's free. So if they want to find it, where do they go?
Yeah. Thank you. At fulleryouth.org, you can find the report and which you can download for free and other free resources. We're going to continue. We're still learning. We still have a lot of research to go. So one thing that we're excited about is continuing to share about what's unfolding as we learn about this generation. So we would love for folks to track with us.
Awesome. Yeah. And you're going to continue to do interviews and add data as you go along then, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, as we close, Brad, we in our podcast, we try to make a little space in each episode to just maybe slow down, reflect a little bit, and have kind of just a spiritual formation moment. Would you be able to lead us in just a little bit of a reflective time for a moment?
Yeah. And thanks for the heads up about this. I was thinking about this morning a little bit. And I would love for us to just imagine first, imagine a young person who's really difficult. Okay. And I've got a couple middle schoolers in mind, right? But just pick one of them who maybe is the thorn in your side, who's always kind of causing issues, who's really hard to get through to, or maybe they act up, maybe they cause trouble in some way. And we're going to just pick one of those. All right. And we're just going to close our eyes. And I want us to imagine that person by name, by face, and just imagine holding them up to God's light and seeing them through Jesus' eyes. That whatever kind of, pain or trouble or annoyance they bring to us, just for this moment, to see them truly as a child of God, as beloved, as so worth being known and loved. And to ask for grace for the things that we don't see about them, that God sees. That maybe it's something going on at home that we don't see. Maybe it's a sense of abandonment. Maybe it's some struggle they have. Maybe it's something going on at school. Maybe it's a struggle that we will never see or know about, but God does. And for us to just ask for grace for what God sees in that young person. And so, God, we hold these young people to you in Jesus' name, and we trust you. We trust your Spirit to be at work in them. God, we hold them up to you right now, trusting that you are big enough and strong enough and loving enough to hold them, even when we can't. And God, thank you for seeing and knowing and loving us in the same way. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I hope that's a helpful practice, especially after those hard times in your group where you just have that one kid, to take a little time to just ask God to help you love that kid.
Yes, and to listen to them. I think that's great. Well, thank you, Brad. And so folks can visit fulleryouth.org right?
Absolutely.
And get that. We'll put that website in our show notes as well, so people can access that. But thank you, Jessi. Thank you, Brad, for being on today. It was a really good conversation, really great research and great data that I think will help us as we continue to move forward, trying to reach this generation.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
First a Follower is a podcast from Youth for Christ USA. The views and opinions shared by hosts or guests are their own and don't necessarily reflect the official positions of YFC or any partnering ministry. This podcast is for encouragement and general information only, and it isn't meant to provide legal, medical, mental health, or theological advice. If you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to learn more about how to get connected with Youth for Christ in your area, visit yfc.net.